This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. Hey everybody, today's episode is a bit different. To begin with, I am recording this to video as well as audio. The first time I've recorded a solo episode to video too, and plan to release it in that format on my fledgling YouTube channel at some point. So that's different. It's also different because it reflects sort of a changing of the tide for me in my own work, and I want to share some of what that's about and some of what that will mean practically speaking as it relates to this podcast, and share the why behind some of that, so that in case illustratively it's of any value to you as you approach your own decisions. I'm by no means the master of decision making or strategizing or any of those kinds of things, but simply offer my experience to you in case it's useful to you, just to throw it alongside your experience and see what comes of it. There comes a time in all of our lives when we realize that it's time for a change, and that sense has been building for me, and I'm not making any dramatic changes professionally or personally, but I am making some changes to allow my focus and energy and attention to be given to things or rather to be allocated differently. Since this podcast started in April of 2020, coincidentally or providentially, right as COVID was becoming a thing, I've produced it about every 2 weeks, give or take, a month here or there, where I would take a brief creative break over the summer or over the holiday season. And that consistency of production has been a great benefit to me because it's forced me every 2 weeks to produce a cogent thought in the case of a solo episode for everyone listening, or to produce cogent thoughts on an interview conversation that I've had with a special guest. And if you've listened for any amount of time, you've been privy to some really amazing stories from some really cool people. And over the course of the almost 4 years of producing every 2 weeks, my thinking has evolved, my conduct in the world has evolved quite a bit as a result, and I'm so grateful for that. I didn't anticipate when I started the podcast that one of the top, maybe the primary benefit even of doing the podcast has been my own evolution. And I'm so grateful for that, and that I was willing to respond to the call to adventure that presented itself to me now almost 4 years ago, and move forward with it. It has been a tremendous learning experience, and met some wonderful people and had some really engaging conversations. And a handful of those have literally changed my life, as has the requirement of producing a cogent thought every few weeks in the case of solo episodes. And I've begun to realize that my energy and attention has begun to gravitate toward other things. One of them would be a project I'm working on with a friend and a former guest on this podcast, John Rittner. He and I have been working on how to sort of formulate many of these concepts and tools that I've assembled along the way, none of which, by the way, are entirely unique. They're just things that I've accumulated along the way and maybe formulated a little bit differently or articulated a little bit differently or in my own way. My sense was that they were beginning to amount to a sort of unified field. That's probably too lofty a term, but something that could be configured into an intelligible whole, or a system, or a plan, or a process, or a paradigm. It wasn't clear to me how valid that sense was, and if it had any validity to it, how intelligible it could be made and how accessible it could be made to others. But John and I have been beaten on that thing to see if we could get it into some sort of shape. And even as recently as this morning, when John and I had our regular Friday morning meeting, it became clear to us that this thing does have some shape that we believe will be not only valid, but useful to many other people. And so one of the things I've seen about myself is that as I move through the world and my life, my personal journey and my professional journey are reflect one another very closely. And as I acquire new insights, I also have the willingness and ability to attach to those insights a product or a service that other people can benefit from. So the podcast would be an example, and that's the podcast is a purveyor of the mortality mindset to help us live with guts, gusto, and abandon. The Graveyard Group is another example, a weekly mastermind experience where people come together to cultivate the mortality mindset, work on the things that matter more than others, give them the attention they deserve now before it's too late, so that they can live lives they're outrageously proud of when they die and become someone they genuinely feel good about. One-on-one coaching incorporates the mortality mindset and many other concepts that and tools that I've assembled along the way in my own personal journey that have then been made useful in my professional work as well. And as I move along and acquire insights and deploy them in my own life and then deploy them in my professional world, those things then lead me to additional insights that I can convert into things that can be deployed for others' benefit. Insight plus action equals transformation. You've heard me say that on this podcast before. And so that process has shown up in my personal life. It's been reflected in my professional life. And now this calling, I would say, to figure out how to assemble those various concepts and tools into a cohesive whole for others to benefit from has really grabbed my attention and John's attention too. And so a partnership is forming between the two of us in this area that we are really excited about and are in the very early stages of. And I believe God rekindled our friendship in part, at least for this purpose, and appears to continue to be equipping us to formulate this conceptual system even further to make available to other people. And so it began to be clear to me that there was a tension in my system, especially in the area of time, that producing every 2 weeks new episodes of the podcast was becoming an obstacle to progress in other areas of my life that were important to me. And so even as recently as this morning at breakfast with my wife, we have breakfast come hell or high water every Friday morning. I was just articulating to her my lack of clarity about what to do with the podcast. Some trepidation that putting it aside would be a bad move. Putting it aside altogether would be a bad move. Also acknowledging that I didn't have the same zeal or energy for producing every 2 weeks that I'd once had. And on some level felt like I was starting to phone it in just because the deadline was coming. And that's of no value to anyone, me or you who are listening. And she said, well, why don't you just dial it back to once a month and see how that goes? And true to form, my wife is always my best coach. That clicked and that made sense. And so I decided to create this solo episode today to share the results of that conversation, that I am going to begin producing the podcast episode once every 4 weeks as opposed to releasing every 2 weeks, in order to be able to devote more time, attention, and energy to the newest insight on my horizon that is calling to me, and which is this cohesive framework for living well. And I don't, in case you're wondering, and I hope you don't think this might be true of me, but I don't believe that I am assembling a magic bullet or magic bullet, silver bullet, or anything close to one-stop shopping, and that I'm going to provide all the answers to all of your problems. I don't mean that, but I do think that there is something of particular value that if I give more time and energy and attention to it, and with John's partnership, then we will be able to produce something that is of value to many more people. And it certainly has been of value to me in my own life. And I look forward to evolving it in the days, months, and years to come for many more people's benefit. So it's not without some trepidation that I diminish the frequency of uh, episode releases, but people are staying away from this podcast by the thousands and millions already. So the devoted few of you out there who have been listening, I don't imagine this will be upset your apple cart at all. But I wanted to be sure you were aware of that change and some of the why behind it and how I'm approaching that decision. And I hope too that this change ends up producing better results than I could have imagined. Sometimes it's useful just to shake things up because you've been doing it the same way for a while, and it's good to let that way die so that new ways can emerge in its place and be born in its place. And that's my expectation in this case, is that as I change things up and let the every 2 week publication frequency die, that something else will be born in its place that's even better. And I'll be able to see things that I wasn't able to see when I was in that predictable pattern and just kind of stay in that course. So if you remember the big 6 episodes where we talked about courage, humility, truth telling, self-permission, self-responsibility, and self-knowledge, this move for me certainly involves summoning a little bit more courage to do something differently, um, a little bit of humility to acknowledge that I don't know where this is going to go, and um, if I don't even know if anybody's going to care about it. So, and then truth telling, to be honest with myself, that I don't bring the same energy to producing every 2 weeks that I once did. And so for everyone's sake, it would be better for me to acknowledge that and make a change than continue to just plug along anyway out of some misguided sense of duty. And then self-permission. And so this is a big one, to acknowledge what it is that I want to do and to go ahead and give myself permission to do it. And that's what I'm doing. So self-responsibility follows closely on the heels of self-permission, and I certainly will assume responsibility for all of the consequences that come from making this change. Again, we're not talking about life and death decisions here, but it's just good to continue to acknowledge that when I exercise self-permission, um, I do that well when I also exercise self-responsibility. So I'm looking forward to seeing whatever consequences may result that I get to take responsibility for. What else to share on this topic? I have no idea how this is going to land for you guys and what it's like to hear something from me extemporaneously. Um, you may not even listen to this one when you see the title, or you may be immensely bored by this, but um, hopefully not. Hopefully there's something here that's of value to you. This is a glimpse into one of the hero's journeys that I'm currently on as I continue to figure out how to deploy myself in the world and conduct myself in the world to get the best results with my life, not only for my own sense of purpose, meaning, and fulfillment, but in order to be who I am capable of being for the world's benefit. And perhaps it's significant that tomorrow I turn 50. I don't think this decision is the function of some sort of late midlife crisis, because I don't feel like I'm in crisis at all. But maybe there's some poetry in that at this moment I'm making some changes in how I conduct myself professionally in the world, making a sacrifice in the moment in order to pursue something that I think might be of even greater value in the future. I'm sure as soon as I sign off, I'll think of something else that I want to say. One of those things would certainly be how grateful I am for all of you who have continued to tune in and to give me the gifts of your time, attention, and trust, to come alongside me as I move forward in my own life and we move along forward in life together, and to be willing to heed some of what I've shared and to put it into play in your life. And I certainly hope that it has been beneficial to you. And I am going to continue on my own journey, summoning, heaping more spoonfuls of the big six, continuing to deepen my dependence on God, to move forward with conviction that responding to the call in my life is one big part of the work that I've been given to do in this world, beyond the acquisition of material things, beyond um, acquiring a reputation for myself or attempting to become someone who is noteworthy in other people's eyes, as the temptation can be. Um, and in fact, if I'm going to practice the big six, I ought to add in a little bit more humility here and just say, as a professional, cracking the code on how to produce financially consistently continues to elude me. And so part of the reason for reducing the frequency of podcast releases so I can simply spend a little bit more time on business development. And so it's a little bit of a catch-22, because there's a sense in which the podcast is an element of business development, and putting it aside, maybe there's some risk attached to that. But I've decided that I'm not going to be cowed by fear or what ifs, but I'm just going to take the next step. And right now, the next step appears to be reducing the frequency of the episodes of this podcast. And I'm going to continue forward and see what comes of it. So that's probably all for now. So grateful for all of you who've been listening, and hope that now that I will be releasing every 4 weeks, it continues to be a benefit to you. And I would love to hear from you. What would you like to hear about on this podcast? Who would you like to hear from on this podcast? What kind of conversations would serve you? Please let me know. And remember, as always, you are going to die, but you are not dead yet. So get after it.